Okay, welcome. As people start arriving, we will get people to just leave a comment in the box and in the chat box at the bottom here and let us know that you're here, your name. And yeah, so my name is Elise. I work for TCC Canada, and we are an A to Z business solution provider. So we we do things like virtual office spaces. We also offer permanent office spaces and meeting room spaces. So we have a lot of different opportunities for businesses who either are starting out or growing. We also offer just meeting spaces and whatnot. So we have a lot of support for our community. And with the shutdown, we wanted to make sure that we could continue offering support remotely. So we've started a webinar series where we bring on experts in different parts of the field. And yeah, so we have JP with us today. He's going to be talking about podcasting from home, and we will pass it off to him.
Okay. Hi, guys. Yeah, like Elise said, I'm JP. I'll just bring up the presentation here and we'll get into it. We're going to be talking about how you can start podcasting from home, or if any of you are already podcasting, how you can maybe improve your setup a little bit. And we can dive right in. Let's see. So yeah, I'm JP Davidson. I'm a podcast producer, radio journalist, and audio editor. I founded Pop-Up Podcasting, which is a podcast production company and studio here in Ottawa. We're down on Albert Street during normal times, but coming to you from my home studio today, obviously. Some of the podcasts I've worked on over the years for brands like RBC, the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio, Nature Conservancy of Canada are on the screen there. And the one that is in yellow there, I Like You, is how I got into podcasting. So I started as an amateur, really not knowing anything, about 10 years ago now. And learned everything I needed to learn, did some professional training in radio documentary along the way. Made all the mistakes that I'm going to try to help you avoid today, hopefully. But yeah, started from my kitchen table with a friend of mine. So it's definitely something that you can pick up as you go. And that's going to be one of my messages today is just start. Start with the equipment you have, start with the ideas you have, and see how it goes. So this is the studio, as these are actually pictures of the old studio. We've expanded a little bit since these were taken, but we're down on Albert Street next to, across from World Exchange. I'm so happy to help you with studio sessions once we get back to normal life. And we also do remote sessions these days, but I'm going to be helping you with some DIY tips today. So what we're going to cover today, we've got podcasting basics. So what is a podcast, that sort of thing. Some strategy, really getting out of the gate in a positive way that's going to grow your audience from day one. Recording technique, how to get the best sound, connecting with remote guests, very important during these pandemic times, and best practices for editing and distribution. So how do you get this out to your audience? It's not quite as simple as YouTube, where you put it on one platform. There's so many different places people can listen to podcasts, from Spotify to Apple Podcasts, things like that. So I'll show you how all that works, and it's not complicated, but yeah, a little more to it than if we're looking at YouTube or something like that. So podcasting basics. A podcast is just a list of audio files published to the web. And before I go too much further into detail, I should mention we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the session today. So I'll ask you, just for the sake of time, to hold your questions until then, but we'll have hopefully 15, 20 minutes at the end to take your questions. So people subscribe to that list of audio files using iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, things like that, called podcatchers. and they automatically receive updates. And that's really the key of what makes a podcast is this. You get a ping on your phone when there's a new episode, or you check your podcast app and you see this kind of sequential list of new episodes coming out. So it's a subscription model, and that's what gives podcasting a lot of its power, is that once people subscribe, they're sort of hooked in a way that watching a one-off video, or or some other even a one-off piece of audio posted to your website is going to be a little different. So that subscription model is pretty powerful. They can also listen to any file in the list on demand. And the reason that's important to keep in mind is that we're going to have people coming to your show 6 months in, a year in. So often I'll talk to people about making your content at least somewhat evergreen, and making it accessible to new listeners. So just because you're on episode 100 doesn't mean your listenership is caught up all the way. So, and when people visit your podcast for the first time, they might visit podcast episode number 100, and that might be their first listening experience. Because of the way podcasts are generally displayed, they're not going to start at episode 1. So make episode 100 accessible to new listeners as much as you do episode 1. The list of files is called an RSS feed, and that's about as technical as we'll get in this. It stands for really simple syndication, and that's just the method by which people subscribe to your podcast, and also the way that people get the message, or the different distribution platforms get the message that there's new episodes available. And the audio files are usually MP3 files. These are compressed audio files that are that take up not too much room, are easy to stream or download, but still have good sound quality. So my pillars of successful podcasting are as follows. I think podcasting is all about authenticity, and that works well in these pandemic times, because we have babies crying in the background, spouses coming into the room. We're seeing people's homes in the background. So authenticity, this friendly conversational tone, is really important to podcasting. And these kind of pillars are things that distinguish podcasting from other mediums, I think, in a lot of ways. Authenticity can also mean, some people choose to swear on their podcasts, or leave in a lot of ums and ahs, and keep things really conversational. And I think to the listener, that means it's something that's special and different from what I hear when I go to CBC radio, or other talk radio topics. So personalization, I think, is important too. These are niche topics, a sense of customization. When you're setting up your podcast, don't think about how am I going to engage all of Canada. It's more like, how am I going to engage my specific niche as far as my business goes, or my interests go. Because I think one of the things that makes podcasting special is that if I'm like a crazy stamp collector geek, I can like find a, not just a stamp collectors podcast, but a Canadian stamp collectors podcast that focuses on, 1800 to 1900 or whatever. So the content is really personalized a lot of the time. Intimacy, so 90% of listeners listen alone, or most wear headphones. So you're delivering a message right into people's heads, and that makes the medium really special. It fosters a sense of connection, which is my next pillar of successful podcasting. So connection between hosts, co-hosts, guests, and listeners. You're really building a relationship with your listeners, and you should think about it that way. Share some of yourself, your personality, what makes you different in your podcast, and you'll be able to foster that kind of personal connection with people. And then reliability. I think to build an audience, especially, you want consistency of release schedule. So whether it's once a month, once a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever works for you, whatever's sustainable. I recommend generally that people pick a schedule and stick to it. Who's listening? So quickly, just some podcast stats. So we have the familiarity of podcasting term in the US. A lot of people expect these graphs to be real kind of hockey stick graphs where we're going up significantly in recent years as podcasting's gotten more popular, but it's really a steady climb, especially since sort of 2015. We have about 75% of the US population familiar with the term podcasting, at least. That drops a lot by about half as far as the people who listen at least monthly. That's still not a super regular podcast listener, but about 100 million Americans are now listening to podcasts at least on a monthly basis, and that's pretty huge. So that's why we've been hearing so much more about podcasting, and it seems like every celebrity and every company has a podcast these days. Let's talk a bit about planning your podcast. What are the ingredients you can put into your podcast to help it succeed? Start with your audience is always something that I recommend. Think about why they should care about your show. There's 800,000 podcasts in Apple Podcasts and Spotify these days. What's going to make yours stand out? What's the unique value that you provide? And that can be any kind of value. That can be that kind of sense of connection, or it can be something that makes you laugh or feel good, or it can be more on the business side of things. What is the sort of concrete value, tips that I can take away and implement, things like that. But thinking about your audience and what value they're going to take away. And then word of mouth is really important to podcasts. So after listening, what will they talk about? Because that's going to help grow your audience. If you can have some amazing or hilarious or insightful moment in your podcast, and encourage people to share that even, that can really help with the spread of your podcast on social media. Who will listen? Who will they share with the podcast with, and why? So that's sort of building off that last point. Important podcast planning questions. So questions you should ask yourself before you start podcasting. What's your elevator pitch? So, and on our blog at popuppodcasting.ca/blog, we have a blog post that talks about scripting your podcast intro, and often this is your elevator pitch, your intro or your teaser, and it really covers who is this for, what value are you going to provide, who are you, but keeping it very short, especially for podcast intro. So we have some tips on kind of building that out, and that can help you define, in your mind, really what is that show, and who's it for, and help you kind of refine that. Who's the host? So sometimes, if we're DIYing things, we don't have a choice of host. It's going to be us. But if you do have a choice of host, thinking about someone who has that kind of personality and maybe even social media reach, things like that can really help build a podcast audience. What's the format? I think, again, because you're sort of building this relationship built on trust and reliability with your audience, having a consistent format can help with that. I don't think you have to be rigid about sticking to it, but even a format as loose as, every week, this is a long form interview. A lot of podcasts are like that, a long form panel discussion, a long form interview. And that can be a great way of defining your show again before you start. Although I always tell people that episode 10 often sounds a lot different than episode 1. So you have that flexibility to change course as you go and as you learn what works and what doesn't for you and for your audience. But defining a format and sticking to it can help. Is the topic specific enough? That's again talking about podcasting is really great for niche audiences. So we want to narrow in on who is this for, what is this podcast all about? Is the content timely or evergreen? So there are timely podcasts. The New York Times Daily is a great one. So the day's news or the previous day's news, very timely content. But if your podcast can be evergreen, that's even better, because those people who are discovering your podcast a year after you released it will still get value from it. So just thinking about a strategy as far as that goes is helpful. And what is the frequency, length, and span? Again, these things are flexible. Frequency is how often it comes out. So I would try to stick to something, but it might be a matter of feeling out what works and what doesn't. I usually advise people to start out. Don't start with daily or weekly, because that can be a real grind to keep up. So starting with maybe every 2 weeks and seeing how it goes and how sustainable that is for you can be helpful. Length, podcasts are great compared to broadcast media because they can vary in length. So, you can do a 5-minute mini episode and then, a 45-minute full episode. But again, the reliability factor for your audience is helpful. So if you can kind of have a range that you stick to, it can be helpful. And then the span of your podcast. So, and that is to say, how long is it going to go on for? A lot of people are doing mini series of podcasts. It can be a great way to get your feet wet as far as podcasting goes. But those are also harder to promote, because if we're only doing 8 episodes, we don't have that kind of long runway of building the audience over time compared to a show that puts out, 24 episodes a year, kind of thing. But thinking about that, and also building in breaks for yourself. So thinking like, okay, maybe we're going to do a seasonal format. So we're going to do like a 20 episode season, and then take a month off or 2 months off, and then come back with season 2. So these are all options and things you want to think about before you dive in. I've already mentioned this word a few times, but questioning how sustainable your podcast plan is can be really helpful, especially early on. Is it sustainable? So, and some of the shows that you know and love, if you're a podcast listener already, have huge teams of people that work on them, and they take a long time to put out. So podcasting in general is more work than you think it's going to be. So planning something that's sustainable is really helpful. And I'm often talking people down from plans of, okay, I'm going to have like 5 different interviews, and it's going to be a 1-hour show, and it's going to come out every week, down to something more sustainable. Like, okay, let's take those 5 interviews and make them an episode each and put them out. Maybe that's still weekly, but you're spreading yourself a bit over a longer period of time, which can be helpful for audience growth. So how long should it be? This is a question I get a lot. And there's no real solid answer to this. But I think you can pick 2 of these. So easy to produce, good quality, good content, or long. And so you can have an easy to produce long podcast, but it might not be that great if you're just sort of hitting record and letting it go for an hour and a half. A good long podcast isn't going to be easy to produce. An easy good podcast probably isn't going to be long. And you probably can't do all 3. So think about that. I think also there's a trend towards shorter podcasts, shorter attention spans in podcasting, because there's more podcasts out there. People's listening times are shorter. I often advise around 20 minutes, and some research has kind of proven that out, that 20 minutes is around the average length of some people, of the American commute or something like that. So being able to listen to a full episode in the car during a commute, or on transit, can be helpful. So something to think about. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about the length of your podcast is this graph. So this is from NPR One, I think, their podcasting app. They released a bit of data, just very small sample size on this, but I think it's illustrative of a lot of podcasts. You start losing people as soon as they start listening, and your listenership is gonna drop over time. So making those first 5 minutes of your podcast count, and instilling this interest, this excitement. That's why we see so many things where people are previewing content that comes later on a show. You're going to want to stick around for this, because it's kind of a fight against that downward trend of, at the beginning of the show you have 100% of your listenership, and it starts to drop from there, and it can be important for attracting new listeners as well. So keeping it short might mean your graph doesn't go to zero halfway through. So let's talk about remote recording apps and gear now. I'm going to focus on that scenario because we're in this pandemic situation, but there's a lot of great gear out there for recording. 2, 3, 4 people sitting in a room together. But we're gonna talk more about doing things remotely today. So, like I said earlier, I usually recommend starting with what you already have. So a lot of people do, have a headset or a USB microphone, something like that. And everyone just about has a smartphone these days. So smartphones can be great recording tools or microphones. And then I'm going to focus on Zoom today. But there's a few reasons for that, and I'll share them. But Skype, FaceTime, lots of different sort of voice apps can work well for podcasting. Some specific gear recommendations. You're going to want a microphone, ideally. If you already have a Blue Yeti or some other USB mic or headset, I wouldn't necessarily rush out and swap it for one of these. But if you don't have anything and you're looking to buy, these 3 microphones on the screen right now, so the Audio-Technica AT2005, the ATR 2100X, and the Samson Q2U are all sort of essentially the same microphone, and they all plug into a laptop, a Mac or PC by USB, and sound pretty good. Usually I recommend people get a mic stand. So there's a cheap one, that Hamilton one listed there. The mics that are pictured here all come with USB or come with mic stands. The problem is they don't get your mic high enough off the table. So ideally we want my visual aid here, we want the microphone up near our chin level. And these the mic stands that come with the mics often don't do that. So you can buy a separate mic stand, or use a stack of books or something like that to get the mic up close to your mouth, and that's going to always improve the sound quality. Windscreens, the foam on my mic here is helping to reduce some of those plosive sounds or wind sounds if you're outside. And then headphones, and these ones, the Sony ones pictured here, are the ones I'm wearing. They're the ones I really like. But you can use earbuds, anything. We really want something that will cut the feedback loop of if you're playing the audio of your guest, of your remote guest, over speakers, and then it's feeding back into your microphone, we're going to have issues often. So any kind of headphones, but headphones are something you're gonna want. These microphones that I have here are also nice because they come with an XLR connector, which is sort of a more professional audio connector. So you can integrate them with those portable digital audio recorders and mixers and things like that down the line if you want to do more in-person podcasting later. So I find them really versatile, and they're not too expensive. I like these I like these over a Blue Yeti that a lot of people have for a couple of reasons. One is they're a little bit cheaper. The other is that they're dynamic microphones instead of condenser microphones, and um, you don't need to know too much about the technicalities of what that means, but essentially they have a tighter pickup pattern, so they're going to pick up less background noise and more have a small bubble around the microphone of what they're picking up. So yeah, just my recommendations. But again, if you have a Yeti or something like that, you can certainly use it. And it's just a matter of doing a little experimenting, getting it close to your mouth, not too close that you're getting big pee pops. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the specifics of recording with Zoom. We've been doing a lot of Zoom sessions at Pop-Up Podcasting since we closed the studio temporarily. So we've been getting a lot of experience with this. No matter what you use, so it says or another VoIP app. VoIP is Voice over Internet Protocol. So things like Skype and FaceTime. Whatever you're recording with, it's important to record on 2 tracks. And what that means is that we're going to get an audio file for yourself as the host, and then a separate audio file for your guest. And that makes editing a lot easier because if your guest is really quiet and you're really loud, you can easily say, lower this one, raise this one, and you're good. Same thing if your guest's dog starts barking while you're doing your intro. If you're recording on 2 tracks, that's okay. It's kind of like Photoshop layers where you can remove one and keep the other. Most of the defaults for Zoom and Skype and other apps that let you record are to smush everything onto 1 track, and then that dog barking forever connected, and there's no separating them. So that's why I always recommend recording on 2 tracks. Recording on both ends if possible, and this is more for if you're having a session with someone who's like your co-host. So if you and your co-host are always meeting up online to do your podcast, record on your end and on your co-host's end, and then sync them up in post. That's going to mean that you both have recordings that didn't get squished down and sent over the internet and are susceptible to all those interruptions and bad sound that we associate with internet calls. So record on both ends if possible. If you're on a Mac, you can do that in QuickTime, and if you're on a PC, you can do that in I think it's just called Voice Recorder. So those are apps that everyone has on their computers. Hierarchy of communication methods. So when you're connecting with a guest on the internet over Zoom or some other app, Zoom to Zoom is best. So whether they have the app on their smartphone or on their computer, that's usually going to sound the best. The next option would be something like Zoom to landline. Landlines have better sound generally than cell phones. And so if your guest is less technically inclined, you can have them just call into the Zoom line, put in the meeting ID from their landline. Then my last choice would generally be Zoom to cell phone, even though almost no one has landlines and everyone has a cell phone these days. It's not going to sound as good. Never use speakerphone, and everyone wears headphones. I've already talked about that kind of feedback loop that can happen. So making sure that that you're not using speakerphone. Like I said as well, getting the microphone close to the person's mouth is important. So if you're on speakerphone, you're generally feet away from the microphone with your phone or your speakerphone sitting on the table, far away from your mouth. So that's what I would recommend. The one workaround for that is if somebody's, well, you're still wearing headphones, but if you're on a Zoom call and your guest is on their cell phone, they can kind of wear headphones and hold up their phone relatively close to their mouth, not too close because we're going to get those pee pops, but kind of off to the side in the pizza slice kind of pose, as I call it, and that can be really helpful to the sound quality. Let's see, use a USB external mic or headset and make sure you select the right input. So that's always super important in these Zoom calls. So your computer has multiple microphones. So I have this microphone plugged into my computer. My webcam has a microphone, and then if I was on a laptop, the laptop would have a built-in microphone. So I've seen lots of times when people have a beautiful, Blue Yeti or one of the ATR 2100 microphones that I was talking about earlier, sitting in front of them, but in the Zoom settings, they have the wrong microphone selected. They have the little laptop microphone selected. So be careful about that. And finally, test it. Call somebody that's, that is willing to hang out on a call with you, record it as you would an episode of your podcast and listen back and see if there's room for improvement. Can't emphasize that enough. There's always things that go wrong with these things. Key Zoom settings for podcasting. So still on Zoom. Like I said, by default, Zoom will smush everything onto one track, and you won't be able to separate those layers out later on. So there's a setting in the Zoom recording settings that's called record a separate audio file for each participant. Make sure that that's checked, because that'll go, that'll give you that separate track for each person. Record on this computer, not the cloud. So do a local recording. The Zoom host should always, the person doing the recording should always be on a PC or on a Mac, not on an iPad or a smartphone. And they need to choose record on this computer because cloud recording with Zoom doesn't give you, again, those separate layers of audio for each person. And like I said, they should be on a PC, not an iPad or smartphone. Again, the iPad and smartphone apps for Zoom don't give you that separate track recording option. And then I usually select automatic recording. So I turn on automatic recording in Zoom, and it's a lot easier to stop recording on a call that I don't want recorded than to get to the end of a podcast interview and realize I forgot to hit record. So if you turn on automatic recording in Zoom, you're always covered. You never have that horrible moment of realizing you hadn't been recording, which happens to every podcast producer at least once. There's more info about how you can set up Zoom for podcasting at popuppodcasting.ca /blog/Zoom, as you can see on the screen there. Another option for recording that's outside of Zoom is Squadcast. And I haven't used it a lot myself, but I hear good things about their, well, I've tested it a bit, and the sound quality is actually better than Zoom. It's a little more technical for your guests to use than Zoom, especially if they're sort of a business person who's used to Zoom. But what Squadcast does that Zoom doesn't is it actually does that local recording on each person's computer and then syncs it up afterwards. It sort of automates that process for you and can lead to better sound quality than Zoom. So check that out. I think squadcast.fm is their website. Tips for you and your guests to sound great on your podcast recording or other Zoom call or other internet call. Hold the phone. So like I said, if the app allows you, just hold the phone up to your ear, or if you're connecting with people by telephone, get them to hold the phone up to their ear. Recording via AirPods or other kind of Bluetooth headset can degrade the sound quality and can add sort of dropouts or choppiness to your recording. Use the app. So like I said before, Zoom to Zoom is going to sound better than somebody calling in via phone to a Zoom meeting. So try to get your guests to use the app on their smartphone. And I say mobile app rather than computer for the guest, at least, because it gives them versatility with microphone placement. Basically, they can do this. They can hold the phone up to their mouth, get that microphone a few inches from their mouth, and sound a lot better than a laptop where when you're in normal laptop using position, you're a couple of feet from the microphone, and that can degrade your sound quality. Find a quiet spot. Tough for some folks these days with a family, but yeah, as much as you can, put a post-it note on your door. Do not disturb, podcast recording in progress. Important silence alerts, either on your computer or on your mobile phone during the recording. We don't want those things breaking in and causing issues. Conserve bandwidth. That can be an important one as well. Essentially, we want to give as much bandwidth to the audio if we're doing an audio-only podcast. So usually during a Zoom call, we'll turn off the video so that all of the bandwidth can go to audio. We're less likely to have audio dropouts and audio quality issues if we turn off the video. We also want to turn off, your Google Drive running in the background, or Dropbox, or online backups, anything that's going to eat up bandwidth. And since you're podcasting from home, maybe also your kids, gaming or doing other things with your internet connection can be issues. Wear headphones. I said it earlier, and it bears repeating. Wearing headphones will only improve the sound quality overall. And like I said as well earlier, getting the microphone close to your mouth is always going to be an issue. And that's because of this thing called the signal to noise ratio. So every room has a certain amount of noise in it, whether it's people walking by in the hall, the ventilation system, traffic noise, computer hum, all these things. And if your microphone is far away from your mouth, it's going to be picking up those sounds sort of almost equally with your voice. So moving the microphone nice and close to the mouth means the signal that we want, which is the person's voice, gets picked up disproportionately compared to the background noise. So that can be really helpful. Common issues with recording, levels, recording too loud or too quietly. Fortunately, Zoom and other apps usually help with this with their automatic levels. Echo, noise, interruptions. So having soft surfaces around you if you can. Again, that post-it note on the door, don't interrupt podcast recording in progress. All those things do help with sound quality. Technical issues, interference. So again, like testing, making sure you're not picking up sounds you don't want to be picking up. And not pressing record. Like I said, it happens to everyone once. It happened to me about 5 years into my radio career, where I had to stop an interview and say, you know what, we have to start over again because I'm an idiot and I didn't press record. So be vigilant about that one. Here's a little bit about controlling your environment. I'm going to breeze through this fairly quickly, so we still have time for questions, but potential issues with a recording environment are things like hard surfaces, large spaces, fans, fridges, HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, phones that might ring, pets, doorbells, computers, jewelry, jangly jewelry near the microphone can be an issue. People you're not interviewing being nearby and chiming in from off mic can be an issue. And the solutions to those recordings. So arriving early if you were recording elsewhere, but in this case, just building a bit of time into your recording session so that you and your guest could troubleshoot any of those issues for the first 5 minutes of your planned recording time. Being bossy, so especially if you're connecting with people on webcams initially, and you're seeing their dog pacing around in the background, or the radio, you're hearing the radio being on, not being afraid to kindly ask them to turn those off so that you get your best recording, or move their microphone closer to their mouth, things like that. Again, post-it notes on doors and fridges, staying close with the mic, monitoring. So monitoring in this case means listening as you're recording so that you can hear those issues and figuring them out. And finally, acknowledging the issue on tape. If you're in this situation where you're at home and the baby starts crying in the background, and you say, sorry, that's my baby crying in the background. I think something that, or there's a concert happening next door and it's picking up on the mics. I think a distraction that your audience is puzzling out what is that sound is going to be more distracting than something where you say, like, here's what the issue is. I'm sorry we couldn't avoid it. It's going to help. So very quickly, editing. I find editing is podcasters' secret weapon / secret shame, because it's our secret shame because we say and we rephrase things and we re-ask questions a lot more often than the final listener realizes. So we're not quite as slick as we seem in the final recording. But it's a secret weapon because you can make your podcast much more interesting, flow much better if you do some editing. So I always recommend people do at least some editing with their podcasts. How to sound like a pro even when you aren't. Avoid the temptation to overscript. Most of us aren't professional voice actors. We don't know how to read a script in a natural, convincing way. So don't. My biggest pet peeve is a podcast that's just fully scripted, a fully scripted faked Q&A, because I think you'll realize that really quickly. So making sure that you just see, not as slick as we seem in the final version. We'll edit all this out. Avoid the temptation to overscript. So yeah, just have bullet points, have a plan for your show, but don't script the whole thing, because it'll come off as not authentic, which is one of our pillars of podcasting. Write the way you speak. If you wouldn't say it, don't write it. So we write and we speak quite differently. And if you are scripting elements, make sure you write them in a way that is natural. And the only way to find that out is to read your script and modify it if you're getting stuck on certain words or if it sounds unnatural. Multiple takes, editing, and narration are your friends. So those tools allow us to take something that was maybe an awkward in-person or remote interview and turn it into something a lot slicker. And some casual podcasts are more produced than you realize. So again, what you hear as the final product is not necessarily what happened in the moment. And I think sometimes it can make people feel a lot more comfortable in the interview process. If you say, hey, we're going to edit, if you need to take a break, if you want to rephrase something, you have the option of doing that. And that can kind of help people let their guard down, because it's an unnatural thing to have a recorded conversation. Hindenburg Journalist is the app that I recommend people use for editing. It's fairly easy to learn, but you can record and edit a great sounding podcast using, GarageBand is free on Macs, Audacity is free on PCs. This is about $100 for the journalist version, and it's got some advantages over Adobe Suite or things like that. It's a bit more affordable. It's cross-platform between Macs and PCs. It's relatively intuitive and easy to use. Non-destructive editing, so you can always undo something if you cut something out and realize later you didn't want to cut it out. And it's made for podcasting and radio versus being made for music, which a lot of these apps are. Plus, it's got these handy features: auto level, easy compression, voice profiler. I don't really have time to go into those right now, but anyway, it's an app. They don't pay me to say this, but it's an app that's been great for us and our company. Publishing. So very quickly before we switch over to question time, publishing. So it's a place online for your files. So hosting, a host, or your publisher. These are all things that are kind of interchangeable, but it's a place where you store your files on the internet so people can access them. It also often creates and manages the list of episodes and compiles any analytics or stats about how many people are downloading your show, where they're getting the show from, what country they're in, stuff like that. The iTunes Store or Apple Podcasts is not a publishing platform. So you're never really uploading your show or your podcast to Apple. It's one of the directories in the same way that Spotify is and others where people can find podcasts. It's one of the apps people can use to listen, but it's not where you put your files. So that's where these companies that I have on the right here above the iTunes logo are Simplecast, Libsyn, and Spreaker. I point a lot of people to Simplecast for podcasting. Like the name implies, it's pretty straightforward to set up, but basically the way it works is you send your files to Simplecast, that's where they live, and then we link your Simplecast account to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all those places. And then every time you upload a new episode, it automatically goes to all those other places. But it's important to go beyond Apple Podcasts. Spotify is the biggest, but there are all these other directories where people can find your podcasts. So usually I recommend people submit to these. So smart speakers it's another avenue for your content to get out. Both Alexa and Google Home can allow people to listen to podcasts. You can see I've highlighted TuneIn on the Alexa side of things. So make sure your podcast is in TuneIn if you want to get it out that way. And then if it's in Google Podcasts, it'll be available on Google Home. These are audiograms. They can be a great way to share clips from your show in visual mediums like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. They just create a visual animation element. And there's tools that you can use to make those available on our website. A great podcast landing page is important to your podcast success. And we're really emphasizing the places people can subscribe. Because like I mentioned earlier, the subscription model of podcasting is what makes a podcast audience stick around. So on this example website for a podcast, we do have a play button down at the bottom so people can hit play on your most recent episode. But we're emphasizing the subscription model and the different apps that people can subscribe in first, because that's really what we want people to do. And this is why we do that. People listening on the web, this is drop off over time. So people listening on the web kind of drop off as they listen. But if you're on an app, people are probably listening in the car, while at the gym, while doing chores, and they're going to stick around till the end. So you can see on the app side, people drop off right at the beginning if they're not hooked by your content, and then they stick around otherwise and drop off at the end, which is what we want. Finally, a little plug for pop-up podcasting. We do remote podcast production. So we will help facilitate these kinds of remote podcasting sessions if you're not feeling like doing a DIY, and you can find out more about that at popuppodcasting.ca. That's it. Sorry, I went a bit over time, but we do have time for some Q&A. So we can get into that now, but also if you have questions that linger later on, my email is there on the screen, and you can ask questions via email as well.
That was fantastic, JP. Thank you for taking the time to walk people through that while people compile their questions and leave them in the chat bar. I know that this kind of stuff, like you mentioned in the session, it sounds easy when you listen to them, right? Like these podcasters make it seem like it takes, 5 minutes, they're natural speakers, but there's so much behind the scenes that go into it that you don't even really know what you don't know until you see it. So I think that was really helpful for people, and even just the basics on like mics and being able to compile a good quality podcast is really difficult. So I hope that was super helpful for people. I'm sure it was very helpful for people.
Yeah, and I hope it's not. I hope it didn't make it seem too intimidating. I've tried to cram a lot into that session, but it is doable DIY. I don't want to emphasize selling my services too much because that's how I started, and there's lots of great content out there that'll give you hours of in-depth sort of online training and resources in each area that I kind of skimmed over quickly there.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, now's the time, right? Like we've got some extra time on our hands, try it out. There's no harm. And I think, like you said, the biggest thing for people is just getting started. It's a scary world, and, it takes some vulnerability to put yourself out there. So
totally. And it's also nice that you always have control over your content. So if you put out your first 10 episodes and then you hate 9 of them later, you can take down those 9 and kind of reboot your show, restart, with what you've learned along the way. So,
No, definitely. I heard somewhere that it takes doing something 50 times before you get good at it, before you start to get good at it. So those first 50 ones are all trial and error, and you can go back and delete them later if you want, but you'll see the progress if you're consistent with it.
Yeah. And I always emphasize, again, like not to temper people's ambition, but like I am tempering their ambition. Don't be too ambitious.
Well, you got to take one bite at a time.
Yeah. Do something simple. Like maybe it's your whatever industry you're in, here's my 3-minute tip. And you're doing these scripted monologue 3-minute tips as you're stepping your foot into podcasting before you do an hour-long show with 5 different segments.
Right. Well, an hour of talking is a long time, so it's a skill that I'm sure takes some time to build up to.
As someone who just did that, I can say it's true.
Yeah, definitely. If people don't have any questions, it doesn't look like we've had any questions, which means you've done a great job explaining everything. You can reach out to JP. You said you can reach out to him in the future if you do have questions. We will be posting this recording up on our TCC Canada website in our resource page. So we've linked it on our Facebook page and our social media pages. Just keep an eye out. We'll do another refresher of the link, but it's just tcccanada.com, and you go to the resources section. We have all of our webinars up there. So this will be up within the next 24 hours. And lots of good information that you can go back to and revisit. But thank you, JP, for taking the time. I know that it's busy for you right now and being able to join us today.
Yeah, no, happy to do it. Thanks, Elise.
Perfect. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Thanks again.